Welcome to Sleepytime History. True stories from the pages of history for a full night's rest. If this is your first time listening, let us know where you're tuning in from, or make a request for a future episode. And if you like what you hear, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us immensely. All right, it's time to settle in, relax, and take a wander through the pages of history and storytelling. Tonight, we're going to be exploring the remarkable true story of Sir Edmund Hillary, a humble New Zealander who dared to attempt the world's highest peak alongside Tenzing Norgay. Together, they set out to reach the 29,000-foot summit of Everest, something many believed was all but unachievable, a near-mythical pursuit, fraught with danger, one that had already claimed the lives of too many foolish enough to make the attempt. Revered as sacred for centuries by the local Nepali people, who called it Sagamatha, Mount Everest and its summit were untouchable. At the time, Hillary stood on the brink of the unknown. Sharp winds sliced the thin air, and more than one expedition had seen explorers succumb to the cruelty of altitude sickness and frostbite, or vanish into whiteout blizzards without a trace. Every footstep, every swing of an ice axe welcomed new hazards, hidden crevasses, roaring avalanches, and the relentless squeeze of dwindling oxygen that tightened the chest and dulled the mind. Yet, Hillary pressed on, fueled by determination and an unwavering belief that even the impossible could yield to careful persistence. Though he was not alone in this quest, Hillary emerged as the steadfast anchor, wrestling his doubts in the biting cold. Tonight, as we drift into sleep, we remember that true conquest isn't about bold declarations, but the courage to face what towers above us. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let's journey alongside Sir Edmund Hillary, ascending through the remote Himalayan kingdom of Nepal to the ominous, frozen, windswept climbs of Everest. Edmund Hillary was born in the rolling farmland of Tuakau, New Zealand in 1919, a place of soft hills, long summers, and skies that stretched wide and unbroken. His father was a journalist turned beekeeper, a man of method and belief, while his mother, a schoolteacher, encouraged learning above all. In this gentle, open land, Edmund grew tall and awkward, a boy who often felt more at ease with books than with people. School days were not his finest hours. He was shy, often uncertain in conversation, and found himself retreating into long walks and daydreams. But everything began to shift on a school trip to Mount Ruapehu, a snow-capped volcano in the center of the North Island. There, wrapped in cold wind and crunching snow, Edmund felt something awaken in him. It was the beginning of a lifelong draw to high places, places where strength mattered more than talk, and where purpose could be found in every step forward. He returned home, changed. At university, he studied mathematics and science, though lectures never held him the way the hills did. Soon, he joined his father and brother in the family beekeeping business, a summer job that left the winter months free. free to climb. The southern Alps became his training ground. Towering and remote, they offered long routes, biting winds, and the kind of raw experience that no guidebook could teach. Hillary climbed with a mix of determination and simplicity. He wasn't graceful or especially fast, but he was methodical, tireless, and utterly dependable. Cold and fatigue never deterred him. It was here that he learned the rhythm of crampons on ice, the discipline of rope work, and the calm needed when the weather turned. When the Second World War came, Hillary served as a navigator in the Royal New Zealand Air Force, flying long missions over the Pacific. He survived a serious burn injury in a shipwreck near the Solomon Islands, but returned home with his drive intact, if not sharpened. After the war, he returned to climbing with renewed focus, pushing into higher and harder routes. By the late 1940s, he'd made a name for himself in local mountaineering circles, not as a star, but as a man others could rely on when things turned difficult. Then, in 1951, came the invitation that would shift the course of his life. A reconnaissance expedition was being planned by the British to approach Everest from Nepal. Hillary was selected to join. He was thrilled, but also measured. Everest wasn't just a mountain. It was the mountain. No one had reached the top. Many had tried. Some had vanished. But for Hillary, the appeal wasn't glory. It was the test, the purity of challenge, the chance to go higher, further, and deeper into himself than ever before. He accepted. And just like that, the boy from New Zealand's plains turned once more to the mountains, stepping into history, one footfall at a time. The year was 1951, and as the long shadow of the Second World War began to lift from the world, a new kind of ambition stirred in the hearts of mountaineers. Everest had stood undefeated for decades. Approached from Tibet in the 1920s and 30s, it had turned back every attempt, some with finality. Now, political changes had closed the northern route, but Nepal, newly open to foreigners, offered a new path to the summit from the south. The British, who had long dreamed of claiming Everest, were assembling an expedition, not for a full summit attempt, but a reconnaissance, a careful study of the route, terrain, and dangers that awaited. Edmund Hillary, by then a respected name in climbing circles, was invited to join. He was not a nobleman, not a household figure, just a strong, reliable climber with a steady gait and a deep reservoir of endurance. Hillary joined the team, led by Eric Shipton, a man known for his love of exploration over fanfare. Together, they traced the Khumbu icefall and reached the western Coombe, high on the mountain's shoulder. It was difficult terrain, a maze of crevasses and collapsing seracs, but Hillary moved through it with patience and resolve. What he saw there stayed with him. Everest, for all its looming presence, no longer felt unreachable. It felt within the realm of human effort. Barely. 2 years later, the real opportunity arrived. A full-scale British expedition was being planned for 1953. This was no small venture. It would require dozens of porters, tons of equipment, and the coordination of climbers, doctors, and Sherpas across weeks of relentless altitude gain. Hillary was chosen again, this time as a lead climber. The decision marked a shift, a recognition that experience, stamina, and composure mattered more than rank or origin. The team's other key member would be Tenzing Norgay, a skilled Sherpa from Darjeeling with years of Himalayan experience. Tenzing was more than a guide. He was a climber in his own right, with unmatched instincts and a calm presence that steadied those around him. Hillary and Tenzing soon formed a natural partnership, both practical, both understated, both focused on the climb ahead. Their base camp was set at the foot of the Khumbu Glacier in March of 1953. From there, they would move methodically up the mountain, establishing camps at increasing elevations. The British team was led by Colonel John Hunt, whose military background brought a sense of structure to the expedition. Assignments were made, equipment tested, and routines set. Progress was steady, but every camp gained meant thinner air, colder nights, and a growing strain on the body. Above them, Everest loomed white and still, catching the morning sun and drawing a line between earth and sky. Beneath their feet, the glacier groaned and shifted. Life became a rhythm of hauling, climbing, and resting in tents, where the air never seemed to fill the lungs completely. For Hillary, this was where he belonged. Each step higher was a stripping away of all distraction. There was only movement, effort, and the mountain. And somewhere above, just out of reach, was a summit that had waited long enough. The path to Everest summit began with a long, deliberate journey through the lower Himalayas, a winding approach that allowed the body time to adjust to the rising altitude. The expedition wound its way from the plains of Nepal up into the Khumbu Valley, through forests of rhododendron and across swinging rope bridges, watched by curious villagers and prayer flags fluttering in the breeze. By the time they reached base camp at over 17,000 feet, the air had grown noticeably thinner. Every breath came with effort, and even simple tasks demanded more from the body. Yet the mood among the team remained focused. Tents were arranged, supplies sorted, and plans carefully reviewed. The ice fall above them, cracked, unstable, and constantly shifting, was the first real barrier. The Khumbu icefall is one of the most dangerous features on Everest, a frozen cascade of towering seracs and deep blue crevasses. It groans with hidden movement, unpredictable and unforgiving. Hillary and his teammates began the slow work of carving a path through it, fixing ropes and placing ladders across gaps where the earth simply fell away beneath their feet. Progress was measured in yards. Each hour brought them closer to Camp 1. Above the icefall lay the western Coombe, a vast glacial valley cupped between steep ridges. It was stunning and surreal, a place where light bounced off walls of snow and time seemed suspended. But the altitude was merciless. Headaches pulsed with each heartbeat, and sleep came fitfully, if at all. Food was difficult to keep down, and conversation became sparse, each man conserving his strength. As the team climbed higher, they established Camp 2 and then Camp 3, ferrying loads up and down, always climbing high and sleeping low to acclimatize. Every piece of equipment was hauled by hand, with support from the Sherpas, whose stamina and instinct kept the expedition moving forward. Hillary's bond with Tenzing Norgay deepened with each shared task. Tenzing's experience on the mountain was unmatched. He'd climbed high on Everest before, and his sense of timing, terrain, and weather was crucial. Hillary, methodical and focused, matched him well. They worked in tandem, often without the need for many words. Rope work, snowcraft, and shared hardship built something between them that could not be taught, only earned. At Camp 4, just below the South Col, the weather turned. Fierce winds howled through the ridges, and the temperature plummeted. Progress halted, and tents were battered by gusts that made rest all but impossible. Patience was now as important as preparation. When the storm cleared, the team resumed its advance, pushing toward the South Col, a windswept saddle between Everest and Lhotse. It was here that final summit plans would be made. 2 pairs would be selected for the attempt. The first team, Tom Bourdillon and Charles Evans, would go first. If they failed, Hillary and Tenzing would follow. The waiting began, and above them, Everest remained unmoved, tall, stark, and still untouched by human step. The South Col sat at just under 26,000 feet, a barren, wind-scoured plateau where survival depended on movement, shelter, and sheer will. Up here, the body began to erode, cell by cell, under the strain of altitude and cold. Time was short. Any effort beyond this point had to be carefully measured. Every hour above the Col came at a cost. Hillary and Tenzing settled into their high camp with determination rather than urgency. They were prepared, having made multiple climbs up and down the lower camps to acclimatize. Yet even so, each breath now felt shallow, and the simplest tasks, melting snow for water, lacing boots, left them drained. They had been chosen as the second summit team. The first pair, Bourdillon and Evans, made their bid on May 26th. They reached the south summit, painfully close to the top, but were forced to turn back due to equipment failure and exhaustion. Their attempt had pushed the route forward, but hadn't finished the climb. Now all attention turned to Hillary and Tenzing. The 2 men had grown into a partnership, forged by effort and shared purpose. Tenzing brought decades of experience in the Himalayas. His strength was unwavering, but more than that, he possessed a calm steadiness that others naturally trusted. Hillary, for his part, had earned respect for his reliability. He never rushed, never hesitated, and never gave in to the small defeats that could chip away at morale. Together, they worked with the team to prepare for the final assault. Supplies were hauled up to the highest camp, Camp 9, just below the south summit. Oxygen bottles, cooking fuel, food, and sleeping gear were carried in relay, step by heavy step. On the 28th of May, Hillary and Tenzing made the climb to Camp 9, where they would spend a freezing night perched above 27,000 feet. Their tent was pitched on a narrow ledge, secured with ice axes. The wind scraped at the canvas, and the thin air made every movement a conscious act. They boiled snow for tea, adjusted their gear, and prepared as best they could. There was no ceremony to it, no final pep talk or grand gestures, just two men, side by side, getting ready to step into the unknown. Sleep came only in fragments. Beneath their layers, frost gathered. Above them, the summit awaited, and far below, unseen but felt, the world held its breath. The morning of May 29th, 1953, began in darkness and biting cold. Hillary and Tenzing emerged from their tent just after 4 a.m. The first hint of dawn was faint on the eastern rim of the world. The temperature was well below freezing. Their breath rose in slow bursts as they readied themselves. Oxygen masks secured, boots checked, and climbing gear in place. Every movement demanded effort. At this altitude, known as the death zone, the human body cannot survive for long. Muscles weaken, minds grow fogged. But both men had trained for this moment, not just in strength, but in discipline. They began their ascent toward the south summit, where the first team had turned back. The slope was steep and narrow, the snow hardened by wind, and below each footfall was a long drop. Their progress was slow but steady, aided by the rising sun, which cast pale gold light across the ridges. Beyond the south summit, the mountain narrowed. A sharp, knife-edged ridge led to what would become one of the most famous obstacles in mountaineering, the Hillary Step. A sheer rock face, some 40 feet high, perched at nearly 29,000 feet, where even strong climbers could falter. Here, the rope came out. Hillary led, chopping footholds into the ice and rock with care, his hands stiff from cold and his breath rasping behind the mask. With a final heave, he pulled himself over the top and anchored the rope for Tenzing to follow. What lay beyond was not easy, but it was possible. The summit slope came into view, a gentle incline compared to what had come before. Step by painstaking step, they moved upward, oxygen dwindling, vision narrowing to just the next movement, the next breath. And then, at 11:30 a.m., they arrived. The summit of Everest. There was no roar of triumph, no crowds, just the sound of wind across snow and the curve of the earth far below. Hillary reached out and shook Tenzing's hand. Then they embraced. Tenzing later buried a few sweets as an offering. Hillary took a photograph. They spent only about 15 minutes on the summit. There was little time and less air. From this vantage, the world fell away in all directions. Mountains once thought vast looked small. Clouds floated below their feet. In that moment, they stood higher than any person had before. But the mountain allowed no lingering. The descent still lay ahead, and it would be just as dangerous. They turned and began their way back down, each step a retreat from history, each foothold a return to the living world. Climbing Everest is only half the journey. For Hillary and Tenzing, standing at the summit had been a moment of profound stillness, but not rest. The descent from 29,000 feet would be just as testing as the climb up, perhaps more so. Their bodies were already weakened, their oxygen supplies running low, and the path ahead was steep, exposed, and unforgiving. They began the downward trek with deliberate care. The narrow ridge and the Hillary step, which had been obstacles on the way up, now became hazards in reverse. One slip here would mean a fall of thousands of feet. Their movements were cautious, their thoughts clear. The rhythm of descent, plant, step, breathe, took over, and they reached the south summit without incident. From there, the snowfields sloped more gently, but the effects of altitude were building. Hillary later recalled a growing sense of exhaustion, the kind that creeps in slowly but fully, urging the body to stop. But stopping was not an option. They pressed on, down toward the ledge, where their tent and gear waited at Camp 9. When they finally reached it, Hillary unzipped the tent and saw the face of fellow climber George Lowe. With a worn smile, he delivered the understated words that would become legend. "Well, George, we knocked the bastard off." That night, they rested at high camp. Though oxygen tanks were nearly empty and the cold bit deep, the knowledge of success brought with it a kind of inner warmth. Below them, the rest of the expedition was waiting, unaware of the outcome. The next day, they descended to the South Col, where the news spread with a mix of disbelief and elation. The path ahead, back through the camps, down the icefall, and into the green valleys of Nepal, would take time. But the weight of the climb was lifting. When the expedition finally returned to Kathmandu, word had already begun to travel. Radio messages had reached Britain just in time for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The ascent of Everest became a symbol of something larger, an emblem of determination, endurance, and the reach of human effort at the very edge of what was thought possible. Hillary and Tenzing were celebrated, but they carried themselves as they always had, with focus, humility, and a steady pace. Their time at the summit had lasted minutes, but what they had achieved would echo for generations. The journey back from Everest was long, but filled with a sense of quiet satisfaction. As Hillary and Tenzing descended through the camps, their success traveled ahead of them like ripples on a still lake. By the time they reached the lower valleys, people lined the trails to greet them. In Nepal, the achievement was shared with joy and deep pride. Tenzing, in particular, was welcomed not just as a climber, but as a son of the Himalayas, who had helped place his homeland at the heart of a global story. When the expedition reached India, the scale of what they had done began to unfold. Crowds gathered at train stations, newspapers printed photographs, and dignitaries queued to offer congratulations. Both men were awarded medals. In Delhi, Tenzing was honored by Prime Minister Nehru, while Hillary began to understand that life, from this moment onward, would never quite return to how it had been. Back in Britain, news of the ascent reached London on the morning of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. It was seen as a triumph of the Commonwealth. New Zealander and Nepalese, side by side, conquering the world's highest peak. Hillary was knighted almost immediately. Tenzing received the George Medal and widespread acclaim, though not a knighthood, an oversight that, in time, stirred discussion. Still, the respect between the two men never wavered. Upon returning to New Zealand, Hillary found his home transformed. He was now Sir Edmund, a national hero, though he remained distinctly unchanged. The same man who had once carted honey and camped on ice fields now stood before crowds and journalists, offering measured words and a modest smile. Fame, though vast, sat lightly on him. He had never climbed for accolades. Everest had been a test of endurance, not a path to recognition. And now, with the summit behind him, he was already thinking ahead, not to new peaks, but to how he might give back. For Tenzing, too, the attention was immense. In the Sherpa villages, his name was spoken with reverence. Children were named after him. Though the world saw him as a hero, he remained deeply connected to his roots, speaking often of the mountain not as something to conquer, but as something to respect. Together, the two men had achieved what no one before them could, and yet both, in their own ways, remained grounded, aware that true achievement lies not in the moment of victory, but in how one carries its weight afterward. In the years following the Everest ascent, Edmund Hillary did not turn inward or retreat from the world. Instead, he turned back to the mountains, not to climb, but to help. During the expedition, Hillary had come to know the Sherpa people, not only as companions on the trail, but as families, teachers, and farmers living in the shadow of the world's highest peaks. He had seen how few resources they had, no schools in the higher valleys, little access to medicine, and only the most basic infrastructure. In 1960, he founded the Himalayan Trust, an organization dedicated to improving education, healthcare, and access to essential services in remote mountain communities. Over the years, Hillary and the Trust helped construct more than 24 schools, several hospitals, and small airstrips that allowed medical aid and supplies to reach places once accessible only by foot. He raised funds tirelessly, not with grandeur, but with steady purpose, often visiting donors in person and explaining the work in his calm, methodical style. For the Sherpas, Hillary was more than a visitor or benefactor. He became known simply as Burra Sahib, the big man, not because of his fame, but because of his presence, his loyalty, and his actions. In 1975, tragedy struck when his wife, Louise, and youngest daughter, Belinda, were killed in a plane crash in Nepal. They had been on their way to join him for more of the Trust's work. The loss was immense, and Hillary grieved in the only way he knew, by continuing. He poured himself further into the mission, ensuring that the projects they had begun would endure. Over time, he became something of an elder figure in the Khumbu region, a familiar face lined by wind and time, who had once stood atop Everest and now stood beside them in their everyday needs. It was this legacy that Hillary would later say he was most proud of. Not the summit, not the knighthood, but the bridges built between worlds. Though Everest had been the pinnacle of Edmund Hillary's climbing career, his appetite for exploration did not end there. In the years that followed, he sought new challenges, not in fame or conquest, but in discovery, endurance, and meaningful contribution. He ventured not upward this time, but outward, into the vast cold reaches of the polar world. In 1958, he led the New Zealand component of the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition, an ambitious crossing of the southern continent. Against expectations and orders, Hillary and his team pushed all the way to the South Pole, becoming the first to reach it overland since the legendary Amundsen and Scott expeditions nearly half a century earlier. In 1985, he took to the skies. Alongside astronaut Neil Armstrong, Hillary flew over the summit of Everest in a small twin-engine plane, a symbolic gesture by two men who had each, in their own way, stepped into the unknown and lived to tell the tale. But even amid these remarkable adventures, Hillary never strayed far from service. His work with the Himalayan Trust continued year after year, and he remained deeply involved in New Zealand life, advocating for environmental protection and youth development. He published books, gave lectures, and met world leaders, but he seemed to wear all of it lightly, never allowing the world's attention to alter the man at the center. In New Zealand, he became a beloved national figure, not simply for what he had done, but for how he had lived in the decades after. He remained an advocate for the Himalayas, the environment, and for people living in remote, underserved communities. He continued to write, to speak, and to encourage young people toward adventure, not for recognition, but for the growth that comes from facing something difficult and enduring it. Sir Edmund Hillary, passed away in 2008 at the age of 88. His death was mourned around the world, especially in Nepal, where flags were lowered in his honor and prayers were offered from villages nestled high beneath the snow lines. In New Zealand, a state funeral was held, but more enduring than the ceremony was the memory of a man who had risen to fame and yet remained unchanged, solid, grounded, and generous. His legacy lies not only in that frozen peak above the clouds, but in every classroom built in the Khumbu Valley, in every young climber who dares to begin the long trail upward, and in every act of courage done without fanfare. His life was not measured in records or riches, but in resilience and service. A path climbed not for glory, but because it was worth the effort. That's all for tonight's journey through history. Whether you're fast asleep or still drifting there, thank you for listening. Until next time, rest well.